Episode 3 on taxes in America, the Reagan years. And we begin right now. Since they became permanent in 1913, income taxes have taken quite a roller coaster ride. The income tax started at just 3% and eventually ballooned to 94% of the wealthiest American salaries. Democrats are normally associated with higher tax rates, and in most cases, with good reason. However, in 1962, John F. Kennedy proposed a massive tax cut. Before him, from 1953 to 1961, Republican Dwight D. Eisenhower told Congress,
"No one would like a tax cut more than I would. And I'm quite sure that the United States people want a tax cut as soon as it can be done. And I'm certain also of this, that the American people also know what kind of standards they want in national security, the safety of their country, in the amounts invested for peace, and in the amounts invested for, you might say, raising or meeting the human requirements of our own people at home." Now, in some of these, like disaster relief, I have put recommendations before the Congress, asking that the states share in this, at least in a minor way, so as to get the efficiency of local responsibility, a local concern for the money to spend into the thing. But there's all sorts of ways in which the federal government has been assuming responsibilities by law that, if continued, are just going to cost money. And it's just fatuous to get up and say we're just going to save all this money and then not do something about federal responsibilities already given to them.
Since the top tax rate under Eisenhower was 91%, he must have felt the American people's desire for spending on military and foreign aid far outweighed their need or desire for a tax cut. It's also true that the collector of taxes, the IRS, first brought into existence in the Civil War period and later revived in 1913, has been used on multiple occasions as a weapon by government officials. That was just one of the multitude of problems our founding fathers were concerned about. In allowing the United States government to grow so large and so powerful, it would now have the ability to use the many levers of power at its disposal to gain and keep power. It has led to corruption. With the massive amount of money and bureaucracy brought about by the collection of income taxes, the federal government has the ability to use a nearly all-powerful IRS to threaten its enemies. A few years later, with the presidential election of 1976 on the line, then President Gerald Ford and candidate Jimmy Carter battled over taxes in a debate, some of which sounds very similar to the rhetoric we hear today.
In view of the very large budget deficits that you have accumulated and that are still in prospect, how is it possible to promise further tax cuts and to reach your goal of balancing the budget?
At the time, Mr. Gannon, that I made the recommendation for a $28 billion tax cut, 3/4 of it to go to individual taxpayers and 25% to American business, I said at the same time that we had to hold the lid on federal spending, that for every dollar of a tax reduction, we had to have an equal reduction in federal expenditure, a one-for-one proposition. And I recommended that to the Congress with a budget ceiling of $395 billion, and that would have permitted us to have a $28 billion tax reduction.
Governor Carter, your response?
Well, Mr. Ford is changing considerably his previous philosophy. The present tax structure is a disgrace to this country. It's just a welfare program for the rich. As a matter of fact, 25% of the total tax deductions go for only 1% of the richest people in this country. And over 50% of the tax credits go for the 14% of the richest people in this country. When Mr. Ford first became president in August of 1974, the first thing he did in October was to ask for a $4.7 billion increase in taxes on our people in the midst of the heaviest recession since the Great Depression of the 1940s.
Carter's class warfare argument apparently resonated with enough Americans to help him win the election. Taxes remained over 70%, under his administration. And as most Americans are no doubt aware, the economy under the great Jimmy Carter was the worst in peacetime since the Great Depression. Interest rates, unemployment, and inflation all skyrocketed under Carter, and Americans endured gas lines and shortages and a general dampening of American morale. Into this environment came a former actor, former governor of California, Ronald Wilson Reagan. Although his middle name, Wilson, was an ode by his parents to Woodrow Wilson, this man couldn't have been further from it. A true conservative, socially and fiscally. Reagan received advice from economists like Art Laffer and Milton Friedman. After his election in 1980, he promptly fought for and obtained for Americans a massive tax cut in 1981, lowering the top tax rate to 50%. After sparking the economy and pulling the United States out of its economic and morale malaise, he was ready to go for even more. In 1985, from the Oval Office, Reagan made this pitch on further tax cuts to his fellow Americans.
In 1981, our critics charged that letting you keep more of your earnings would trigger an inflationary explosion, send interest rates soaring, and destroy our economy. Well, we cut your tax rates anyway, by nearly 25%. And what that helped trigger was falling inflation, falling interest rates, and the strongest economic expansion in 30 years. Over the course of this century, our tax system has been modified dozens of times and in hundreds of ways. Yet most of those changes didn't improve the system. They made it more like Washington itself, complicated, unfair, cluttered with gobbledygook and loopholes designed for those with the power and influence to hire high-priced legal and tax advisors. But there's more to it than that. Some years ago, an historian, I believe, said that every time in the past when a government began taxing above a certain level of the people's earnings, trust in government began to erode. He said it would begin with efforts to avoid paying the full tax. This would become outright cheating, and eventually a distrust and contempt of government itself, until there would be a breakdown in law and order. Well, how many times have we heard people brag about clever schemes to avoid paying taxes, or watched luxuries casually written off to be paid for by somebody else, that somebody being you? I believe that in both spirit and substance, our tax system has come to be un-American. How would the proposal work? The present tax system has 14 different brackets of tax rates ranging from 11 to 50%. We would take a giant step toward an ideal system by replacing all that with a simple 3-bracket system with tax rates of 15, 25, and 35%. By lowering everyone's tax rates all the way up the income scale, each of us will have a greater incentive to climb higher, to excel, to help America grow. The power of these incentives would send one simple, straightforward message to an entire nation. America, go for it. To young Americans wondering tonight, where will I go? What will I do with my future? I have a suggestion. Why not set out with your friends on the path of adventure and try to start up your own business? Follow in the footsteps of those 2 college students who launched one of America's great computer firms from the garage behind their house. You too can help us unlock the doors to a golden future. You too can become leaders in this great new era of progress, the age of the entrepreneur.
He and his policies were derided by the left, derisively referred to as Reaganomics. He was mocked, called stupid, reckless, and senile. However, again, Reagan succeeded in lowering taxes. In fact, instead of 35% for the top rate, he actually lowered it even more, to just 28% in 1986. Once again, despite his critics, the American economy boomed. Today, many of the same people who reviled Ronald Reagan sing his praises. Up next, what are the prospects for taxes today and tomorrow?
Glenn Beck.